Hey creeps, it's Horror Free for All. Continuing my passion project I affectionately call My Favorite Horror in 4 Color, a series where I look at 1940s to 1980s horror anthology comics, not necessarily in the EC Comics brand that has made horror anthology comics popular over the years. And I look at my favorite stories and specific issues and just talk about my favorite stories that I think deserve attention on this social media platform. Because, in my opinion, I think horror anthology, specifically the comics, are left out of the discussion a lot of the times because while you have these great monoliths of movies and TV shows spreading awareness about the subgenre, the comics have fallen by the wayside, and the comics inspired these things to become popular to begin with. Now, I mentioned in my previous video that in my first installment, I touched on my favorite Charlton comic horror anthology story called The Black Closet. And I mentioned that that one was by far my favorite one. And while that's true, I do have a second favorite. And this one came out in the late 1970s. It appeared in the series called Scary Tales in issue number 20. Released in June of 1979. The story in question was written by Nicholas Cuddy and drawn by Joe Staton. The story in question is called Film Freak. Now, if you're a first-time viewer of this series, I'm actually going to go ahead and show you the panels of the entire story that you can read along with before I get into my review. So if you would like to do so, please take the time to read along and enjoy the story. Now, with that out the way, let's talk about this story, Film Freak. Now, I discovered this story relatively early on when I became obsessed with horror anthology comics. I actually found this issue in a dollar bin, and I was really mesmerized by the cover being like a tentacle monster and seeing some, astronaut-looking people on the cover. And luckily, there is a gem of a story tucked inside there. And this is my favorite kind of discovery when it comes to this series because often than not, I'm more excited to find these little hidden gems in books you don't expect to find than hearing a big buzz around a popular book and being mildly let down with it. Now, looking at the story, it's quite easy to follow. You have a professional woman who's named Fiona. She's a wife of a man who supposedly used to be a very fine gentleman and that would wine and dine her. But because she's a career woman and because she doesn't necessarily put her career on hold for her marriage, she's slowly lost grip on her husband. Her husband has fallen out of being a gentleman and doing the nicest things for her that he used to do and has now grown into an obsession of sorts. And the obsession involves a science fiction movie. She even breaks down and takes him to the theater in the beginning of the story just to feel close to him and see why he loves the movie so much. But she can't really see it the way he sees it, and she can't help but just stew on how far she's kind of drifted in her marriage away from her own husband. You feel that resentment of her towards her husband. And while the husband's point of view is never explicitly laid out, his obsession seems more innocent. He just really loves this movie and he always wants to watch it. And she does what a loving wife would do for a husband by going above and beyond to create a machine so that he can live within his favorite movie. But this wouldn't be a horror anthology story without some sort of twist. Well, it's quite explicitly laid on the wall here in bold writing but she's using this opportunity of this creation that she's made for her husband to get revenge on him for casting her aside and essentially replacing her in this marriage with a fictional movie. And she's taken it upon herself also to tweak things about the movie so that he can't help himself within this new movie world that he's now found himself in, and it's going to make him hard to, get out of what he's about to be into. And as we see what happens to the husband, he realizes that the movie isn't the same as he thought it was, and something perhaps horrible happens to him. But because, it's playing on the whole motive of revenge is bad, and if you do bad, bad things will happen to you in that classic Tales from the Crypt / EC Comics kind of way, the wife, Fiona herself, in the real world, has to deal with the ramifications that she's created for herself. And we get that cliffhanger before we really get to see what happens to her, but it's heavily implied that shit has hit the fan. Now, seeing what this story is saying up front and center, I think it's bold and clear. This story is about a marriage that has fallen apart. And as we touched on in the previous Charlton comic story, The Black Closet, where I think that story was talking about the expectations of change within a relationship, this story is more of an inflection on what happens when there's change prevalent and how that can affect people in sometimes the worst ways possible. Now, you can clearly see, because this was a story written in the 1970s and because Fiona is a career woman, there's heavy subtext that perhaps Fiona has drifted apart from her husband because she's a career woman and she's left the home life in pursuit of her career. And this was a hot topic back in the 1970s, as more and more women were leaving the home life to work in the career field and try their hands at, making a name for themselves than just being a housewife. And perhaps what the story is saying about Harley is he's drifted away from his wife because he feels abandoned himself. And while I think it sucks that we don't get his point of view to make that concrete, I think that's really the direction this story is supposed to be taken in. Because when you look at what Fiona does with her abilities of being a professor, presumably in science and in technology building and machinery and what have you, she creates this elaborate machine to get back at her husband because she no longer sees the benefit of being in a relationship with a man who won't bend over backwards for her. And this perhaps plays on gender roles and expectations of modern women. And we can definitely peel back that whole onion of how men feel about modern women wanting to have the gender stereotypes placed on them, but not having it placed on women. And it's kind of a backhanded thing. This story is perfect for a modern audience to kind of scrutinize because when you see what happens in the story, I think those messages are perfectly clear. Now, I know it's supposed to be hokey and schlocky and kind of corny. I mean, this is the 1970s after all. This is when horror was kind of at its slump point in history. But there are some really good stories, especially in comics around this time. And this is easily one of the better ones, like I said. Now, the reason why it hits so well is because of the twists it throws in the story. You see, the husband, he's not all made out to be the victim here. He does spend too much focus on his hobbies and his passions over his wife. And you could take this as an inverted argument that maybe the story is talking about how the husband takes for granted his wife and the things that she's willing to do for him. As if you look at her actions in the story, she tries to go to the movies to see his favorite film just to be around him and bond with him. But he doesn't see it like that. He just sees it like, I get more of my fix and my addiction. And you can perhaps inflect this on, how society has programmed this message about husbands and addiction for a long time, since at least the turn of the century, where you go back to the anti-alcohol and abolitionist movements, where they wanted to do away with alcohol because of what it brought to the home life. This perhaps is correlated to the rise of pop culture in the late 70s and the obsession with pop culture in American media. And perhaps the story is trying to use that whole anti-alcohol argument, but replacing it with pop culture for men and how women felt replaced by that. I mean, It's a big swing, but I can kind of see that inversion as well. And while that's, very of its time, and I think if it was the intention, quite ingenious, I just think the story is fun because the husband, he clearly thinks he knows the entire movie, but the wife has the upper hand and has changed certain things about it, which I think is a cool twist. Now, the unfortunate side is we don't get much explanation and fleshing out of the husband being in the movie and perhaps the history of what he knows about the movie per se, but you do get enough there to understand that he's seen this movie multiple times and he's completely stumped at certain scenes, especially when he's thrown into the scene with the big monster and he knows what he needs to do to get out of it, but none of the other characters are clued in because things have been changed. And while I don't think he really understands the gravity of the situation, unlike the audience where we know that Fiona, the wife, really wanted to get revenge on him and essentially end him for being not the husband that she married, where it sends home, the tragedy of it all is that instead of Fiona taking to get a divorce with her husband, who perhaps is destitute of money anyway, so she won't be getting much. Maybe she'll get the house or the apartment or wherever they live. She doesn't see the point of getting divorced with him. She'd just rather end him to show him how much pain she feels. And perhaps, going back to what I said earlier about this being what if change is evident and how that can make people react a certain way, sometimes in extreme ways. Perhaps Fiona has developed some sort of complex where she thinks that she needs to be treated like how she was treated before possibly her career took place and before, Harley was affected by the movie. And the expectation of that and maintaining that level of like wine and dine treatment, I don't know if that's relevant for everyone, but I can tell you for being in a long-term relationship, yeah, that stuff happens early on. But as time goes on, your priorities kind of change in your relationship. And you get to the point where you're comfortable with each other and you don't really have to go out of your way all the time like that to show that you care. And perhaps maybe that's all Fiona wanted. She just wanted to have some sort of validation that Harley genuinely cared about her in the same way that she cared about him. And perhaps maybe at one point this invention was made out of love to show how much she cared about Harley. And perhaps it turned into this revenge exploitation machine, let's say. But who knows? It's never explicitly said, it's only implied. I think what I said does kind of elevate it for me, and that's why it sticks in my mind more than some other ones that you'll see in this series. So, in a nutshell, that's my thoughts on Film Freak. If you read the story, let me know what you thought about it in the comments section. If you love any other Charlton comic stories, let me know as well. It might be a while till I cover another one. I don't have much from Charlton I outright love to this level, but who knows? Maybe I'll find another one soon enough to talk about, or you guys can recommend me one that I might fall in love with. Till next time, take care.